and as you can see, we're going to be translating on the screen. My name is Ashok Gupta, and I'd like to thank Sharon for inviting me here today to share with you my amygdala hypothesis for fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, to give you a bit of background to myself, I suffered from the illness myself for 3 years, and I fully recovered 100%, and I published a medical paper on chronic fatigue syndrome in 2002. And I believe that fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome are caused by a malfunction in the brain. Now, earlier on, Dr. Elvin was talking about central sensitivity syndrome, central sensitivity in the nervous system. Now, the brain is obviously the head of the nervous system, and I believe that that is where the root cause of this condition actually lies. So, I published a medical paper in 2002, and since then, I've been running a clinic in central London, treating patients with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome. And my treatment is all about helping patients understand what the root cause of the condition is in the brain and how they can retrain that part of the brain called the amygdala. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into an explanation of how I think fibromyalgia is caused in the brain, which then causes all the problems in the body. Now, before I do that, I'm very excited to share with you some new research that has been done on my tools and techniques, which is going to be published later this year, hopefully, by the Mayo Clinic, a very prestigious clinic in the US. And they did a study last year on my tools and techniques for retraining the brain, a very small pilot study, and had two groups of people, two groups of patients. One would take their standard care in their clinic, so medication, some CBT, nutrition, etc. And one group then also had my amygdala retraining treatment. And the results are that in the amygdala retraining group, they had 2 to 3 times better outcomes than those on standard care, which is a fantastic result, and those results are going to be published later this year. And once that pilot study is published, we then hope that we will have a larger trial for this particular type of treatment, which is a completely new way of looking at the illness and a new way of actually treating it. Very, very different to what you may have heard before. So how did we get this result? Well, we think that this is all down to a deeper understanding of the illness and techniques to target the core issue, which I'm going to talk about now. I also published a clinical audit in September last year, where we had 33 patients. Let's put these up here. We had 33 patients in the clinical audit, and we had no control group. And the average number of years with the illness was 10.5 years. And these patients were a mixture of chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia patients, but the majority were chronic fatigue syndrome. And after 1 year, 92% of patients made some kind of improvement. But what was very interesting was that 2/3 of patients said that they had experienced an 80 to 100% recovery, and many of those patients had gone back into full-time work. And across the 33 patients, we actually, in terms of their self-assessment scores, they rated themselves at 41% of full functioning initially, and after the treatment, they rated themselves at 77% after 1 year, and that was across all the patients. So it's a very interesting result there. So in terms of future research, I'm very interested in working with various doctors and institutions to discuss what kind of trials, initial pilots we can do with this treatment. And for instance, last week I had a meeting with the key rheumatologists and neurologists and head of those departments at Hadassah Hospital, and they were very interested in potentially doing some kind of trial here in Israel, which is very exciting, so we're going to see where that goes. So what I'm going to do now, I'm sure you're very intrigued to know what is this hypothesis, what is this cause you think is happening. So I'm going to take you through that hypothesis now. So, the amygdala. The amygdala is, well, there are two of them inside the brain, and they are in the limbic system of the brain, or the more emotional centres of the brain, a few inches behind the eyes. And if we look at, there's so much research, some of the research you heard earlier on, in terms of could fibromyalgia be caused by abnormalities in the brain? And certainly we know from a lot of research, some examples here, that the perception of pain is different in the brain. As we heard earlier, the pain signals are magnified. And the pain reduction system in the brain is less effective. We also know from some recent research that there are structural differences in the brain where there's actually reductions in the amount of grey matter, the amount of material actually in the brain. And some of these changes are very similar to the ones seen in chronic fatigue syndrome as well. And obviously we know that the central nervous system is likely to be highly sensitized, and I hope this explanation might be one hypothesis. Might be one hypothesis to explain this. Studies have also shown that there is a higher rate of post-traumatic stress disorder in patients with fibromyalgia, and higher rates of anxiety and depression, and I'm going to explain how this might be linked. So, the first starting point is that amygdala in the centre of the brain. Its purpose is to defend the brain and the body from danger. So as we see in the diagram there, it takes in stimuli from the outside world, it interprets those stimuli, and it creates a unique response. Now, one of the most common responses of the amygdala is the stress response. So when we feel fearful or we feel angry, that response is from the amygdala. But actually, in fact, the amygdala has a multiple of different responses depending on the source of the danger. It's not just fear and anger, it's many other unique responses. And the amygdala's job is to keep us alive. So we have that basic diagram there, stimuli, and the interpretation, and then the response. Now, what we know is that the amygdala can make mistakes and can be over-defensive, over-cautious. So as an example, if you see a stick on the ground, your brain might think that it's a snake, and it will create a fear response, even though actually it's just a piece of rope or a stick. Okay. Now, here I'm going to be talking about fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome. I believe that at the beginning of the illness, somebody goes through a traumatic experience, maybe lots of stress for 1 or 2 years, or it can be just acute stress for like 1 or 2 months, combined with some kind of physical injury or pain syndrome. So for fibromyalgia, it might be some kind of accident, like a car accident, or it can be some kind of persistent pain, like back pain or whatever. And a combination of that stress response and that physical injury then creates symptoms in the body. So the symptoms on the left-hand side. In chronic fatigue syndrome, instead of some kind of pain in the body, often it's some kind of virus or bacterial infection, which creates a period of post-viral fatigue. So that often is the slight differences between the initial cause if we were to separate the two illnesses. But obviously with the two illnesses, there's a lot of crossovers as well. Now during that time, because there is a lot of stress and anxiety in the brain, the amygdala becomes hypersensitive. And any incoming stimuli become magnified. So you can see the magnifying glass there. It magnifies a stressful stimuli. Now at the moment, the amygdala is only worried about psychological stresses. But when the amygdala is on high alert, it becomes very prone to learning new sensitivities. And so, during a period of time at the beginning of the illness, the amygdala and the rest of the brain learn that any signals from the body now, from that pain or that injury or the viral fatigue, is now a source of intense danger. And what the amygdala then does is hyperstimulate the sympathetic nervous system. And so there on the right-hand side, you can see that the symptoms of the post-viral fatigue or the physical injury, as well as the stress response and the anxiety, create symptoms in the physical body. And then, those symptoms in the physical body, at number 2, they come back into the amygdala, which is hypersensitized. And when I say the amygdala arouses the entire brain. So it's not just the amygdala that is responding. The amygdala then makes the entire nervous system hypersensitive. And so we see that little circle there, that number 1, there's symptoms in the body of pain and from that anxiety. Those signals are experienced by the amygdala and the rest of the brain. So when I say amygdala, I mean the rest of the brain as well. The amygdala at number 2 then creates the stress response and the sympathetic nervous response at number 5. And then that sympathetic nervous response creates the symptoms back at number 6. So it goes round in a cycle like that, in a vicious cycle. Then, any tasks, events, situations, or people which make the symptoms worse, they also become sensitive, the brain becomes sensitive to that. So, any noise, any light, any negative people, stressful situations, food, certain foods, the entire brain and body become hypersensitive to anything which could weaken the body further. So we can see that there, going around in a circle. And to explain